was born Charles Leroy Nutt in Chicago. Ridiculed because of his last name, he dropped out of high school and joined the Army. He found solace in science fiction and fantasy and began writing them himself, selling his first story, The Devil You Say, at the age of 21 to Astounding Stories. It was later adapted as an episode of The Twilight Zone, as was his second story, The Beautiful People, and 6 others. He also wrote more than 20 episodes for the series. His short career essentially ending at the age of 34 when he was diagnosed with a mysterious brain disease, was a prolific one, with scores of short stories, teleplays. In addition to The Twilight Zone, he wrote for Four Star Playhouse, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, Naked City, Route 66, Richard Diamond, Private Detective, Have Gun, Will Travel, and many other programs, and 14 screenplays, most of which were low-budget fantasy and horror films, including Queen of Outer Space, 1958, Premature Burial, 1962, The Wonderful World of the Brothers Grimm, 1962, Seven Faces of Dr. Lau, 1964, The Mask of the Red Death, 1964, and The Intruder, 1962, which was based on his 1959 novel of the same name. He also co-authored a novel, Run from the Hunter, with John E. Tomerlin under the pseudonym Keith Grantland in 1957. Playboy published Black Country in its issue of September 1954, its first piece of fiction. Beaumont was given a posthumous Bram Stoker Award in 1988 by the Horror Writers Association for his collected stories. The Hunger was first published in the April 1955 issue of Playboy. It was collected in the author's The Hunger and Other Stories in 1957. Okay, here is The Hunger by Charles Beaumont. Now, with the sun almost gone, the sky looked wounded, as if a gigantic razor had been drawn across it, slicing deep. It bled richly, and the wind, which came down from a high mountain, cool as rain, sounded a little like children crying, a soft, unhappy kind of sound, rising and falling. Afraid, somehow, it seemed to Julia, terribly afraid. She quickened her step. I'm an idiot, she thought, looking away from the sky. A complete idiot. That's why I'm frightened now. And if anything happens, which it won't and can't, then I'll have no one to blame but myself. She shifted the bag of groceries to her other arm and turned slightly. There was no one in sight except old Mr. Hannaford, pulling sitting in his newspaper stands, preparing to close up the drugstore, and Jake Spiker, barely moving across to the Blue Haven for a glass of beer. No one else. The rippling red brick streets were silent. But even if she got nearly all the way home, she could scream and someone would hear her. Who would be fool enough to try anything right out in the open? Not even a lunatic. Besides, it wasn't dark yet, not technically anyway. Still, as she passed the vacant lots, all shoulder high in wild grass, Julia could not help thinking he might be hiding there right now. It was possible. Hiding there, all crouched up, waiting. And he'd only have to grab her, and she wouldn't scream. She knew that suddenly, and the thought terrified her. Sometimes you can't scream. If only she'd not bothered to get that spool of yellow thread over at Younger's. It would be bright daylight now, bright, clear daylight. And nonsense. This was the middle of the town. She was surrounded by houses full of people, people all around, everywhere. He was a hunger, a need, a force. Dark emptiness filled him. He moved, when he moved, like a leaf caught in some dark and secret river, rushing. But mostly he slept now, an animal, always ready to wake and leap and be gone. The shadows came to life, dancing where Julia walked. Now the sky was ugly and festered, and the wind had become stronger, colder. She clicked along the sidewalk, looking straight ahead, wondering why. Why am I so infernally stupid? What's the matter with me? Then she was home, and it was all over. The trip had taken not more than half an hour, and here was Maud running. Julia felt her sister's arms fly around her, hugging. God, my God. And Louise's voice. We were just about to call Mick to go after you. Julia pulled free and went into the kitchen and put down the bag of groceries. Where in the world have you been? Maud demanded. I had to get something at Younger's. Julia took off her coat. They had to go look for it, and I didn't keep track of the time. Maud shook her head. Well, I don't know, she said wearily. You're just lucky you're alive, that's all. Now, you listen. He's out there somewhere. Don't you understand that? It's a fact. They haven't even come close to catching him yet. They will, Julia said, not knowing why. She wasn't entirely convinced of it. Of course they will. Meantime, how many more is he going to murder? Can you answer me that? I'm going to put my coat away. Julia brushed past her sister. Then she turned and said, I'm sorry you were worried. It won't happen again. She went to the closet, feeling strangely upset. They would talk about it tonight. All night. Analyzing, hinting, questioning. They would talk of nothing else, as from the very first, and they would not be able to conceal their delight. Wasn't it awful about poor Eva Shillings? No, Julia had thought from her sister's point of view it was not awful at all. It was wonderful. It was priceless. mice in high white collars, groaning a little, panting a little, working about the house. Endlessly, untiringly, they would squint at pictures, knock them crooked, then straighten them again. They swept invisible dust from clean carpets and took the invisible dust outside in shining pans and dumped it carefully into spotless apple baskets. They stood by beds whose sheets shone gleaming white and tight, and clucked in soft disgust and replaced the sheets with others, all day, every day, from 6 in the morning until most definite dusk, never questioning, never doubting that the work had to be done. They ran like arteries through the old house, keeping it alive, for it had become now a part of them, and they part of it, like the hand-crank mahogany Victrola in the hall, or the lion-belted sofa, or the Boutel piano, 10 years silent, its keys yellowed and decayed and ferocious, like the teeth of an aged mule. Nights they spoke of sin, always of other times and better days. Maud and Louise, sitting there in the bellying heat of the obsolete but steadfast stove, hooking rugs, crocheting doilies, sewing linen, chatting. Occasionally Julia listened, because she was there and there was nothing else to do, but mostly she didn't. It had become a simple thing to rock and nod and think of nothing at all, while they traded dreams of dead husbands, constantly relishing their mutual widowhood, relishing it, pitching these little fragile ghosts into moral combat. Ernie, God rest him, was an honorable man. So were they all. Julia would think, all honorable men. But we are here to praise Caesar, not to bury him. Jack would be alive today if it hadn't been for that trunk lid slamming down on his head. That's what started it all. Poor Ernie. Poor Jack. He walked along the railroad tracks, blending with the night. He could have been young or old, an age-hiding beard dirtied his face and throat. He wore a blue sweater, ripped in a dozen places. On the front of the sweater was sewn a large felt letter, E. Also sewn there was a small design showing a football and calipers. His gray trousers were dark, with stain where he had fouled them. He walked along the tracks, seeing and not seeing the pulse of light far ahead, thinking and not thinking. Perhaps I'll find it there. Perhaps they won't catch me. Perhaps I won't be hungry anymore. You forgot the margarine, Louise said, holding the large sack upside down. Did I? I'm sorry. Julia took her place at the table. The food immediately began to make her ill. The sight of it, the smell of it. Great bowls of beans, crisp-skinned chunks of turkey, mashed potatoes. She put some on her plate and watched her sisters. They ate earnestly, and now, for no reason, this, too, was upsetting. She looked away. What was it? What was wrong? Mick says that fellow didn't die, Maud announced. Julia. What fellow? At the asylum that got choked. He's going to be all right. That's good. Louise broke a square of toast. She addressed Maud. What else did he say when you talked to him? Are they making any progress? Some. there's a bunch of police coming down from Seattle. If they don't get him in a few days, they'll bring in some bloodhounds from out of state. Of course, you can imagine how much Mick likes that. Well, it's his own fault. If he was any kind of a sheriff, he'd have caught that fellow a long time before this. I mean, after all, Burlington just isn't that big. Louise dismembered a turkey leg, ripped little shreds of the meat off, put them into her mouth. Maud shook her head. I don't know. Mick claims it isn't like catching an ordinary criminal. With this one, you never can guess what he's going to do or where he'll be. Nobody has figured out how he stays alive, for instance. Probably, Louise said, he eats bugs and things. Julia folded her napkin quickly and pressed it onto the table. Maud said no. Most likely he finds stray dogs and cats. They finished the meal in silence. Not, Julia knew, because there was any lull in thought, merely so the rest could be savored in the living room next to the fire, a proper place for everything. They moved out of the kitchen. Louise insisted on doing the dishes, while Maud settled at the radio and tried to find a local news broadcast. Finally, she snapped the radio off angrily. You'd think they'd at least keep us informed. Isn't that the least they could do? Louise materialized in her favorite chair. The kitchen was dark. The stove warmed noisily, its metal sides undulating. And it was time. Where do you suppose he is right now? Maud asked. Louise shrugged. Out there somewhere. If they'd got him, Mick would have called us. He's out there somewhere. Yes, laughing at all of us too, I'll wager. Trying to figure out who will be next. Julia sat in the rocker and tried not to listen. Outside there was a wind, a cold wind biting. The kind that slips right through a window, buddy, that you can feel on the glass. Was there ever such a cold wind, she wondered. Then Louise's words started to echo. He's out there somewhere. Julia looked away from the window and attempted to take an interest in the lacework in her lap. Louise was talking. Her fingers flashed long silver needles. Spoke to Mrs. Shillings today. I don't want to hear about it. Maud's eyes flashed like the needles. God love her heart. She's about crazy. Could barely talk. God. I tried to comfort her, of course, but it didn't do any good. Julia was glad she had been spared that conversation. It sent a shudder across her, even to think about it. Mrs. Shillings was Eva's mother, and Eva only 17. The thoughts she vowed not to think came back. She remembered Mick's description of the body and his words. She'd got through with work over at the telephone office around about 9. Carl Jasperson offered to see her home, but he says she said not to bother. It was only a few blocks. Our boy must have been hiding around the other side of the cannery. Just as Eva passed, he jumped, raped her, and then strangled her. I figure he's a pretty man-sized bugger. Thumbs like to went clean through her throat. In 2 weeks, 3 women had died. First, Charlotte Adams, the librarian. She had been taking her usual shortcut across the school playground about 9:15 p.m. They found her by the slide, her clothes ripped from her body, her throat raw and bruised. Julia tried very hard not to think of it, but when her mind would clear, there were her sister's voices droning, pulling her back deeper. She remembered how the town had reacted. It was the first murder Burlington had had in 15 years. It was the very first mystery. Who was the sex-crazed killer? Who could have done this terrible thing to Charlotte Adams? One of her gentleman friends, perhaps, or a hobo from one of the nearby jungles, or McDaniels and his tiny force of deputies had swung into action immediately. Everyone in town took up the topic, chewed it, talked it, chewed it, until it lost its shape completely. The air became electrically charged, and a grim gaiety swept Burlington, reminding Julia of a circus where everyone is forbidden to smile. Days passed uneventfully. Vagrants were pulled in and released. People were questioned. A few were booked temporarily. Then, when the hum of it had begun to die, it happened again. Mrs. Dovey Samuelson, member of the local PTA, mother of two, moderately attractive and moderately young, was found in her garden, sprawled across a rhododendron bush, dead. She was naked, and it was established that she had been attacked. Of the killer, once again, there was no trace. Then the state hospital for the criminally insane released the information that one of its inmates, a Robert Oakes, had escaped. Mick and many others had known this all along. Oakes had originally been placed in the asylum on a charge of raping and murdering his cousin, a girl named Patsy Blair. After he had broken into his former home and stolen some old-school clothes, he had disappeared totally. Now he was loose. Burlington, population 3,000, went into a state of ecstasy. Delicious fear gripped the town. The men foraged out at night with torches and weapons. The women squeaked and looked under their beds and chatted. But still no progress was made. The maniac eluded hundreds of searchers. They knew he was near, perhaps at times only a few feet away, hidden, but always they returned home defeated. They looked in the forests and in the fields and along the river banks. They covered High Mountain, a miniature hill at the south end of town, like ants, poking at every clump of brush, investigating every abandoned tunnel and water tank. They broke into deserted houses, searched barns, silos, haystacks, treetops. They looked everywhere, and found nothing. When they decided for sure that their killer had gone far away, that he couldn't conceivably be within 50 miles of Burlington, a third crime was committed. Young Ava Schillings's body had been found less than 100 yards from her home. And that was 3 days ago. They get him, Louise was saying. They ought to kill him by little pieces for what he's done. Maud nodded. Yes, but they won't. Of course they... No, you wait. They'll shake his hand and lead him back to the bug house and wait on him hand and foot till he gets a notion to bust out again. Well, makes you so sure they will catch him? Supposing he just drops out of sight for 6 months and you stop that, they'll get him. Even if he is a maniac, he's still human. I really doubt that. I doubt that a human could have done these awful things. Maud sniffed. Suddenly, like small rivers, tears began to course down her snowbound cheeks, cutting and melting the hard, white-packed powder, revealing flesh underneath even paler. Her hair was shot with gray, and her dress was the color of rocks and moths. Yet she did not succeed in looking either old or frail. There was nothing whatever frail about Maud. "He's a man," she said. Her lips seemed to curl at the word. Louise nodded, and they were quiet. His ragged tennis shoes patted softly on the gravel bed. Now his heart was trying to tear loose from his chest. The men. They had almost stepped on him. They were that close. But he had been silent. They had gone past him and away. He could see their flares back in the distance. And far ahead, the pulsing light. Always a square building. The depot, yes. He must be careful. He must walk in the shadows. He must be very still. The fury burned him, and he fought it. Soon, it would be all right. Soon. Think about it. This here maniac is only doing what every man would like to do but can't. Maud. I mean it. It's a man's natural instinct. It's all they ever think about. Maud smiled. She looked up. Julia, you're feeling sick. Don't tell me you're not. I'm all right, Julia said, tightening her grip on the chair arms slightly. She thought, they've been married. They talk this way about men as they always have, and yet soft words have been spoken to them and strong arms placed around their shoulders. Maud made tiny circles with her fingers. Well, I can't force you to take care of yourself. Except when you land in the hospital again, I suppose you know who will be doing the worrying and staying up nights, as per usual. I'll go on to bed in a minute. But why was she hesitating? Didn't she want to be alone? Why didn't she want to be alone? Louise was testing the door. She rattled the knob vigorously and returned to her chair. What would he want, anyway? Maud said, with two old biddies like us. We're not so old, Louise said, saying, actually, that's true, we're old. But it wasn't true, not at all. Looking at them, studying them, it suddenly occurred to Julia that her sisters were ashamed of their essential attractiveness. Beneath the 20s hairdos, the ill-used cosmetics, the ancient dresses, which did not quite succeed in concealing their still voluptuous physiques, Maud and Louise were youthfully full and pretty. They were. Not even the birch twig toothbrushes and traditional snuff could hide it. Yet, Julia thought, they envy me. They envy my plainness. What kind of man would do such heinous things, Louise said, pronouncing the word carefully. Heinous. And Julia, without calling or forming the thought, discovered an answer grown in her mind, an impression, a feeling. What kind of a man? A lonely man. It came upon her like a chill. She rose from the pillowed chair, lightly. I think, she said, I'll go on to my room. Are your windows good and locked? Yes. You'd better make sure. All he'd have to do is climb up the drain pipe. Maud's expression was peculiar. Was she really saying, This is only to come for you, dear. Of the three of us, it's unlikely he'd pick on you. I'll make sure. Julia walked to the hallway. Good night. Try to get some sleep, Louise smiled. And don't think about him here. We're perfectly safe. He couldn't possibly get in even if he tried. Besides, she said, I'll be awake. He stopped and leaned against a pole and looked up at the deaf and swollen sky. It was a movement of dark shapes, a hurrying, a running. He closed his eyes. The moon is the shepherd. The clouds are his sheep. He tried to hold the words, tried very hard, but they scattered and were gone. No. He pushed away from the pole, turned, and walked back to the gravel bed. The hunger grew. With every step it grew. He thought that it had died, that he had killed it at last, and now he could rest, but it had not died. It sat inside him, inside his mind, gnawing, calling, howling to be released, stronger than before, stronger than ever before. The moon is the shepherd. A cold wind raced across the surrounding fields of wild grass, turning the land into a heavy, dark green ocean. It sighed up through the branches of cherry trees and rattled the thick leaves. Sometimes a cherry would break loose, tumble in the gale, fall and split, filling the night with its fragrance. The air was iron and loam and growth. He walked and tried to pull these things into his lungs, the silence and coolness of them. But someone was screaming deep inside him. Someone was talking. What are you going to do? He balled his fingers into fists. Get away from me. Get away. Don't. The scream faded. The girl's face remained, her lips and her smooth white skin and her eyes. Her eyes. He shook the vision away. The hunger continued to grow. It wrapped his body in sheets of living fire. It got inside his mind and bubbled in hot acids, filling and filling him. He stumbled, fell, plunged his hands deep into the gravel, withdrew fists full of the grit and sharp stones, and squeezed them until blood trailed down his wrists. He groaned softly. Ahead, the light glowed and pulsed and whispered, Here, 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 here. He dropped the stones and opened his mouth to the wind and walked on. Julia closed the door and slipped the lock noiselessly. She could no longer hear the drone of voices. It was quiet, still, but for the sighing breeze. What kind of a man? She did not move, waiting for her heart to stop throbbing, but it would not stop. She went to the bed and sat down. Her eyes traveled to the window, held there. He's out there somewhere. Julia felt her hands move along her dress. It was an old dress, once purple, now gray with faded gray flowers. The cloth was tissue thin. Her fingers touched it and moved upward to her throat. They undid the top button. For some reason, her body trembled. The chill had turned to heat, tiny needles of heat, puncturing her all over. She threw the dress over a chair and removed the underclothing. she walked to the bureau and took from the top drawer a flannel nightdress and turned. What she saw in the tall mirror caused her to stop and make a small sound. Julia Landon stared back at her from the polished glass. Julia Landon, 38, neither young nor old, attractive nor unattractive, a woman so plain she was almost invisible. All angles and sharpnesses and flesh that would once have been called milky, but was now only white, pale white, a little too tall, a little too thin, and faded. Only the eyes had softness, only the eyes burned with life and youth, and Julia moved away from the mirror. She snapped off the light. She touched the window shade, pulled it slightly, guided it soundlessly upward. Then she unfastened the window latch. Night came into the room and filled it. Outside, giant clouds roved across the moon, obscuring it, revealing it, obscuring it again. It was cold. Soon there would be rain. Julia looked out beyond the yard, in the direction of the depot, dark and silent now, and the tracks and the jungles beyond the tracks where lost people lived. I wonder if he can see me. She thought of the man who had brought terror and excitement to the town. She thought of him openly for the first time, trying to imagine his features. He was probably miles away. Or perhaps he was nearby, behind the tree there or under the hedge. "I'm afraid of you, Robert Oakes," she whispered to the night. "You're insane and a killer. You would frighten the wits out of me." The fresh smell swept into Julia's mind. She wished she were surrounded by it, in it, just for a little while, just for a few minutes. A walk, a short walk in the evening. She felt the urge strengthening. "You're dirty, young man, and heartless. Ask Mick if you don't believe me. You want love so badly you must kill for it. But nevertheless you're heartless, understand? And you're not terribly bright either, they say. Have you read Shakespeare's sonnets? Herrick? How about Shelley, then? There, you see. I detest you on sight. Just look at your fingernails." She said these things silently, but as she said them she moved toward her clothes. She paused, went to the closet. The green dress, it was warmer. A warm dress and a short walk. That will clear my head. Then I'll come back and sleep. It's perfectly safe. She started for the door, stopped, returned to the window. Maud and Louise would still be up, talking. She slid one leg over the sill, then the other leg. Softly she dropped to the frosted lawn. The gate did not creak. She walked into the darkness. Better, so much better. Good, clean air that you can breathe. The town was a silence. A few lights gleamed in distant houses. Up ahead, behind, there was only blackness and the wind. In the heavy green frock, which was still too light to keep out the cold, though she felt no cold, only the needled heat, she walked away from the house and toward the depot. It was a small structure, unchained by passing years. Like the Landon home and most of the homes in Burlington, there were tracks on either side of it. Now it was deserted. Perhaps Mr. Gaffey was inside, making insect sounds on the wireless. Perhaps he was not. Julia stepped over the first track and stood, wondering what had happened and why she was here. Vaguely, she understood something about the yellow thread that had made her late and forced her to return home through the gathering dusk. And this dress, had she chosen it because it was warmer than the others, or because it was prettier? Beyond this point, there was wilderness for miles. Marshes and fields overgrown with weeds and thick foliage. The hobo jungles, some tents, dead campfires, empty tins of canned heat. She stepped over the second rail and began to follow the gravel bed. Heat consumed her. She could not keep her hands still. In a dim way, she realized, with a tiny part of her, why she had come out tonight. She was looking for someone. The words formed in her mind, unwilled. Robert Oakes, listen to me. You're not the only one who is lonely. But you can't steal what we're lonely for. You can't take it by force. Don't you know that? Haven't you learned that yet? I'll talk to him, she thought, and he'll go along with me and give himself up. No, that isn't why you're out tonight. You don't care whether he gives himself up or not. You only want him to know that you understand. Isn't that it? You couldn't have any other reason. It isn't possible that you're seeking out a lunatic for any other reason. Certainly you don't want him to touch you. Assuredly you don't want him to put his arms around you and kiss you, because no man has ever done that. Assuredly. It isn't you he wants. It isn't love. He wouldn't be taking Julia Landon. But what if he doesn't? The words spilled out in a small choked cry. What if he sees me and runs away? Or I don't find him? Others have been looking. What makes me think I'll... Now the air swelled with sounds of life. Frogs and birds and locusts moving, and the wind running across the trees and reeds and foliage at immense speed, whining, sighing. Everywhere there was this loudness, and a dark like none Julia had ever known. The moon was gone entirely. Shadowless, the surrounding fields were great pools of liquid black, stretching infinitely without horizon. Fear came up in her chest, clutching. She tried to scream. She stood paralyzed, moveless, a pale terror drying into her throat and into her heart. Then, from far away, indistinctly, there came a sound like footsteps on gravel. Julia listened and tried to pierce the darkness. The sounds grew louder and louder. Someone was on the tracks, coming closer. She waited. Years passed slowly. Her breath turned into a ball of expanding ice in her lungs. Now she could see, just a bit. It was a man. A black man form. Perhaps, the thought increased her fear, a hobo. It mustn't be one of the hobos. No, it was a young man. Mick come to tell her, well, we got the bastard, and to ask narrowly, what the devil you doing out here, Julie? Was it? She saw the sweater. The ball of ice in her lungs began to melt a little. A sweater, and shoes that seemed almost white. Not a hobo, not Mick, not anyone she knew. She waited an instant longer. Then at once she knew without question who the young man was. And she knew that he had seen her. The fear went away. She moved to the center of the tracks. I've been looking for you, she said soundlessly. Every night I've thought of you. I have. She walked toward the man. Don't be afraid, Mr. Oakes. Please don't be afraid. I'm not. hesitantly, rubbing his hands along his trousers. When Julia was close enough to see his eyes, she relaxed and smiled. Perhaps, she thought, feeling the first drops of rain upon her face, perhaps if I don't scream, he'll let me live. That would be nice. Okay, that's the end of The Hunger. But as I said, we're going to read 2 stories. So, this next story is called The Gesture by Gil Brewer in 1956. Gilbert Brewer, 1922 to 1983, was born in Canandaigua, New York, while he was serving in the Army during World War II. His family moved to Florida. He joined them after his discharge. He decided to become a writer like his father when he was 9 years old, dropping out of school to work at various blue-collar jobs while practicing his craft. Although his bibliography shows numerous sales to pulps, such as Zeppelin stories in 1929 and to various detective magazines between 1931 and 1934, they are obviously inaccurate. His first book, 13 French Street, was published in 1951. The first of his 23 novels to be issued in that decade, the same year in which he sold what is probably his first published short story, With This Gun, to Detective Tales. He published nearly 100 stories in all, mostly under his own name, but also under the pseudonyms Eric Fitzgerald and Bailey Morgan. He also ghostwrote novels for Ellery Queen, Hal Elson, Al Conroy, and 5 novels for an Israeli soldier named Harry Harvey. Early in his career, Brewer came to the attention of Joseph T. Shaw, who became his agent. The famous editor of Black Mask saw in Brewer a special talent and thought he could rival the biggest names, but Shaw died of a heart attack in 1952, soon after their association began. Therefore, Brewer cranked out paperback originals at a prodigious rate, often completing a book in a week or less. They are generally dark stories, compared by the editor Anthony Boucher to the works of James M. Cain and Jim Thompson, mostly about ordinary men led down the road to ruin by unscrupulous women. His best-selling book, The Red Scarf, 1958, one of 2 hardcover books he published, sold more than 1 million copies. After the 1950s, however, his output diminished, both quantitatively and qualitatively, largely due to alcoholism and serious injuries sustained in a car crash. A good career that, with better advice and a little more luck, could have been a great one. The Gesture was originally published in the March 1956 issue of the Saint Mystery magazine. Okay, this is The Gesture by Gil Brewer. Nolan placed both hands on the railing of the veranda and unconsciously squeezed the wood until the muscles in his arms corded and ached. He looked down across the immaculately trimmed green lawn, past the palms and the Australian pines, to the beach, gleaming whitely under the late morning sun. The Gulf was crisply green today and calm, broken only by the happy frolicking of the man and woman, laughing, swimming. His wife, Helen, and Latimer, the photographer from the magazine in New York, down to do a picture story of the island. Nolan turned his gaze away, lifted his His hands were trembling, and his thin cotton shirt was soaked with perspiration. He couldn't stand it. He left the veranda and walked swiftly into the sprawling living room of his home. He paced back and forth for a moment, his feet whispering on the grass rug. Then he stood quietly in the center of the room, trying to think. For 2 weeks it had been going on. At first he'd thought he would last. Now he knew it no longer mattered about lasting. He would have to do something. He strode rapidly across the room into his study, opened the top drawer of his desk, and looked down at the .45 automatic. He slammed the drawer shut, whirled, and went back into the living room. Why had he ever allowed the man entrance to the island? Oh, he knew why well enough. Because Helen had wanted it. And now he couldn't order Latimer away. It would be as good as telling Helen the reason. She knew how much he loved her. Why did she act this way? Why did she torture him? She must realize after all these years that he couldn't stand another man even looking at her beauty. Why did she think they lived here, severed from all mainland life? He stiffened, making an effort to wipe away the frown on his face. He reached for his handkerchief and swabbed at the perspiration on his arms and forehead. They were coming, laughing and talking, up across the lawn. Quickly, he selected a magazine from the rack and settled into a wicker chair with his back to the front entrance. He flipped the periodical open and was engrossed in a month-old mystery story when they stomped loudly across the veranda. Every step was a kind of unbearable thunder to Nolan. He was reaching such a pitch of helpless irritability that he nearly screamed. "Darling," Helen called, "where are you?" "Oh, there." She stepped toward him, her bare feet softly thumping the grass rug. He half glanced up at her. She was coffee brown, her eyes excited and happier than he'd seen them in a long time. She wore one of the violent-hued red, yellow, and green cloth swimming suits that she'd designed for herself. He abruptly realized how meager the suit was, and his neck burned. He had contrived to have her make the suit with the least expenditure of material. It was his pleasure to look at her. But not now, not with Latimer here. "What have you been doing?" she asked. He started to reply, looking across at Latimer standing at the entranceway, but she rippled on. "You really should have come swimming with us, dear. It was wonderful this morning." She reached out and tousled his hair. "You haven't been near the water in days." Nolan cleared his throat. "Well," he said. "Well, Mr. Latimer, about caught up, about ready with your story." He wanted to shout, "When are you leaving?" He could not. He sat there, staring at Latimer. The sunny days here on the island had done the man good. He was bronzed and healthy and young and abrim with a vitality that had not been present when he'd first come over from the mainland. "A few more days, I guess," Latimer said. "I wish you'd call me Jack. And I sure wish you two would pose for a few pictures. It's nice enough the way you've been about letting me photograph the island, your home, but..." Latimer left the protest unspoken, smiling half-heartedly. Nolan glanced at his wife. She reached down and touched his arm, her fingers trembling. "After lunch, Jack and I are going to take a walk, clear around the island," she said. "You know, we haven't done that in a terribly long while. Why don't you come along?" "Sorry," Nolan said quickly. "I have some things I've got to attend to." "Sure wish you'd come," Latimer said. Nolan said nothing. "Well," Latimer said, "I've got to write a letter. Guess I'll do it while you're fixing lunch, Helen." "Right," Helen said. I'd better get busy. She turned and hurried off toward the kitchen, humming softly. By the way, Latimer said to Nolan, anything you'd like done in town? I'll be taking the boat across this evening so I can mail some stuff off. Thank you, Nolan said. There's nothing. Well, Latimer said. He sighed and started across the room toward the hallway leading to his bedroom. It had been a storage room, but Nolan had fixed it up with a bed and a table for Latimer's typewriter when Helen insisted the photographer stay on the island. Latimer paused by the hallway. Sure you won't come with us this afternoon? Nolan didn't bother to answer. He couldn't answer. If he had tried, he knew he might have shouted, even cursed, maybe actually gone at the man with his bare hands. He would not use his bare hands. He wouldn't soil them. He would use the gun. He listened as Latimer left the room and sat there breathing stiffly, his fingers clenched into the magazine's crumpled pages. Yes, that's what he would do. Latimer saying he was going to remain on the island longer still clinched it. Nolan knew why Latimer had said that. He wasn't fooling anybody, taking advantage of hospitality for his own sneaking reasons. Didn't Helen see what kind of a man Latimer was? Was she blind, or did she want it this way? The very thought of such a thing sent Nolan out of the chair, stalking back and forth across the room. He could hear Latimer's typewriter ticking away from the far side of the house. Their paradise, their home, their love, torn and twisted and broken by this insensitive person. He heard Helen call them to lunch then, and moving toward the table in the dining room, he felt slightly relieved. He knew that while they were gone this afternoon, he would get everything ready. With Latimer's unconscious aid, Nolan knew exactly how he was going to do it. He sat at the table, picking at his food, listening to them talk and laugh. He tried vainly to concentrate away from the sounds of their voices. This salad's terrific, Latimer said. Helen, you're wonderful. You two've got it made out here. Helen lowered her gaze to her plate. Nolan stared directly at Latimer, and Latimer reddened and looked away. Nolan grinned inside. He had caught the man, but the victory was empty. The long afternoon, thinking about her out there with Latimer, would be painful. They finished lunch in silence. Almost before Nolan realized it, the house was again empty. He could hear them laughing still, their voices growing faint as they moved down along the beach. Helen had even insisted on taking several bottles of cold beer wrapped in insulated bags to keep cool, and carried in the old musette. Nolan could not stand still. He paced back and forth across the extent of the house, thinking about tonight. If he didn't do it tonight, it might be too late. He did not want Helen too attached to Latimer, and he felt sure it had gone very far already. He knew Latimer intended to stay on until he could take Helen away with him. But tonight would end it. He would go along with Latimer to the mainland. Only Latimer would never reach the mainland. The boat would swamp. Nolan knew how to swamp a boat. He knew Latimer wasn't much of a swimmer, and anyhow, a man couldn't swim with a .45 slug in his heart. But Nolan could swim well. He would kill Latimer, take him out into the Gulf, weight him, and sink him. Then he'd bring the boat in and swamp it and swim ashore. He would report it and rent a boat and come home. He knew they were in for a bit of heavy weather tonight. It would be just perfect. And Helen and he would be happy again, the way they had always been. He looked back, thinking over the good times, the time before they'd come to the island, when he'd been hard working at the glass-cutting business he'd inherited from his father. Then more and more he'd become conscious of Helen's beauty and the effect she had on men. And loving her as wildly as he did, he could no longer bear the endless suspense, the knowledge that sooner or later she would leave him. So he sold the business, retired. His little lie. So far as she knew, he simply wanted island life, quiet, unhurried, alone with her. It was true, but not a complete truth. All this time they had been happy, until now. Somebody got wind of the beauty of the island, and Latimer had shown up to do his story. Under conditions imposed by Nolan, no pictures of either himself or Helen. He had allowed one fuzzy negative of them standing against a blossoming hibiscus near the house at twilight. That was all. Wandering through the house, trying not to think of what they were doing now, he found himself in Latimer's room. The unmade bed, the photographic equipment, the typewriter set up on the table. Beside the machine was a typewritten letter. Nolan turned away, but something drew him over to the table. Pure curiosity in this man, Latimer. He stood there staring down at the obviously unfinished letter. An addressed envelope lay beside it. There was a half-completed sentence on the sheet in the typewriter, numbered page 2. The letter was addressed to the editor of the magazine where Latimer worked. Nolan began reading, at first leisurely, then feverishly. Dear Bart, really have this thing wrapped up, but I'm staying on a while longer, just to settle a few things in my own mind, and maybe I'll come up with a bunch of pics and a yarn that'll knock your head off. Sure, beautiful scenery on the island. House is a regular bamboo and cypress mansion. Unhealthy Bart, really sick. He watches her like a hawk. He's ripped with jealousy, and it would be laughable, except that they're both so very old. He must be in his 80s, but she's a bit harder to read. I did a lousy thing. I confronted her with it. You would have too. She's so obviously just enduring everything for his sake, humoring him. My God, think of it. All these years he's kept her out here away from everybody, imprisoned. It's pure hell. She as much as admitted it. I'm staying on, just to see if I can't work it somehow. Get her back to civilization, if only for a vacation, Bart. She deserves it. You should hear her ask how things are out there. It would break your damned heart. There was more, and Nolan read all of it through twice. For a moment longer he stood there, seeing everything clearly for the first time in nearly half a century. Then he walked through the house to his study, opened the desk drawer, took out the .45 automatic. He sat down in his chair by the desk, put the muzzle of the gun into his mouth, and pulled the trigger. Okay, that's the end of the gesture. So, now it's time to go to sleep. Go to sleep. Go to sleep. Go to sleep. Good night. Good night. Good night. Good night. Go to sleep.